So I'm going to go ahead and get started in respect for all of you guys' time. I'm going to be talking about murdered missing Indigenous women and human trafficking. So just a little bit about me. I'm a Spokane tribal citizen, and I grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. And all of our fancy academic authorities, I said, here's my source of authority. My source of authority is my grandma, my great-grandma, and all my grandma friends that have raised me. I grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation, and so I had the amazing opportunity to have lots of time with our tribal elders. I grew up around the Spokane Indian language. I'm actually currently doing some research and projects with the Spokane Language House. Because of a lot of things, boarding schools and different things, my grandmother was the last generation to fully speak the language. She was actually an interpreter for chiefs. This is my great-grandmother, like in 1903, I was doing some legal research, and I was like, I wonder if we'll find any chiefs or any Spokane tribal leaders, and it said Sadie Boyd, Nispelum, I'm sorry, 1913. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my great-grandma. And I was like, oh geez, whenever I was newly married, and whenever we get pregnant, I'm like, I want to make that baby board. And at the time I was pregnant, I just didn't know it. So following week, I brought that to my aunt and I said, let's make this baby board. So we did that. This is two of my four children. I have three biological and a son that I share with my partner. We were at the powwow at the American, down at the Gathering at the Falls powwow at Riverfront Park. We often have powwows. Coming up, there's going to be one at Spokane Falls Community College. So I'd love to invite you guys to come and check out one of our tribal celebrations. I'm currently organizing a powwow at Pauline Flett Middle School. The only school in Spokane named after, well, we have one at Gary Middle School, but they named the Pauline Flett Middle School after Pauline Flett, a Spokane tribal citizen, female, that worked on our tribal language, preserving it for 50 years. So just an amazing story. It's over by the Veterans Center on Assembly. And so we're going to be having a powwow. That's May 20th. And it's open to the public, and it's an excellent opportunity just to kind of learn some more culture. And, we're going to have one here at Eastern, June, pretty close to graduation. I don't know our exact day, but maybe we'll get that out to you guys as well. Just be advised that there's some tough conversations that we're going to have today. And so I always like to talk to folks that if it's triggering or really uncomfortable, you're welcome to step out of the room, or be sure to talk to somebody about any of your experiences. So I served as tribal attorney for my tribe for 10 years, and also served as a tribal court judge for the Spokane Tribe of Indians, as well as the Coeur d'Alene Tribe in Idaho. It's my intersectionality of being an attorney, Indigenous women, and then here my research here at Eastern Washington University is urban and regional planning. And so I'm going to show you, I've had my graduate students do research and map data. That now Washington State Patrol is using our model to map their own data. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. It's really exciting. The work you guys do is important. Even as art students or urban planners or whatever work we do, we can do applied projects to make a difference in our communities. And often when you have marginalized populations that are kind of at the edge, we need to call attention. And so we're going to work to bring attention to this issue, and it's really having an effect now. So our tribal elders ask that we don't start with the data, that really we start talking about Indigenous people are humans, and under the United Nations Declaration, we have rights. Indigenous people, we've suffered from historic injustices, and as a result of colonization, being dispossessed of our lands, territories, and resources. We are recognizing and reaffirming that Indigenous people are entitled without discrimination to all human rights recognized in international law, and that Indigenous peoples possess collective rights which are indispensable for their existence, well-being, and integral development as peoples. So one of our elders, Patricia Whitefoot from the Yakama Nation, asked that we read this UN Declaration. Indigenous individuals have the rights of life, physical and mental integrity, liberty and security of persons, and Indigenous people have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples shall be subjected to any act of genocide or any act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group, shall not be subjected. So even today, Indigenous people fight to protect our children from the social welfare system. In 1978, we had the Indian Child Welfare Act passed, which said, because from, not only the 1800s, early 1900s, were Native children being removed from their homes, it happened right up through the 70s. And we call this the 70s scoop, right? And it happened here and in First Nations up in Canada, where thousands and thousands of Native children were removed from their homes and placed into foster care. This has a big impact on murdered missing Indigenous women because when children age out of foster care, they have no connection to their tribal communities, their families, their people, and so once again they feel odd man out. All of us probably at some times in our lives felt different or odd, and when you are a Native American, obviously, you feel different, you have a different heritage maybe than your family. You age out of foster care, you are more susceptible to human traffickers and people that might lure you in. And traffickers know how to manipulate and talk to young people. You're more susceptible to substance abuse. There's a whole report from Oregon, the Willamette School of Law out of Oregon, about Native American children in foster care. And right now, the Supreme Court is reconsidering the validity of the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978, in which tribes are able to have the courts establish the tribal connection. The very most important resource that we had as Native people was our children. That's the future of our tribe. And they were being removed at alarming rates. And so the Indian Child Welfare Act gave the tribe standing when those children were removed from homes and said, if you remove a children from a Native home, or this children is of Indigenous Native American descent, you have to contact that tribe. Find out which tribe, number one, and second, contact that tribe. And then it sets up a priority placement from that child's family to somebody from that tribe to another Native American. Just giving that child an opportunity to be who they are, right? To have their tribal community. So right now the Supreme Court is reconsidering the Indian Child Welfare Act. So when we talk about human trafficking, just to give you a little background, looking at some of the national data, there are different types of trafficking: sex, and labor. 10,000 individuals identified as trafficked, 7,648 sex and labor, 1,000 victims of trafficking identified, 16,658. This is Polaris's information. We found that during the pandemic, there were a lot of systems that were shut down. One system that wasn't, trafficking. It still continued to go pretty strongly. How does human trafficking happen? It happens online. There's lots of recruitment. Even in some of the rural communities where we struggle with broadband, traffickers still manage to contact young people through social media and other forms, whether it's Facebook or Snapchat. I have close relatives whose daughter got caught up in trafficking. She got a knock at the door one day, and FBI was there saying, is this your daughter? Is such and such your daughter? I'm afraid to tell you that she's being trafficked. When the mother dug deep into Facebook, she found that there were multiple Facebook accounts under multiple names that was associated with her daughter, and there was lots of older men that were friending her to make those contacts. So lots of this happening online with social media, Facebook, Instagram, different access to our young people. You know, and again, during the pandemic, we were shut up in our homes. We thought, oh, our children are safe. Well, it's possible that they're online with social media being contacted by some of these folks. So human trafficking is highly personal. Recruitment by family members or intimate partners is highly reported in the data and numbers for the people that are being trafficked. So recruitment from relationships that of people they knew, a large proportion of the victims recruited by family member or caregivers. How scary is that? 21% of all victims in 2019 to 31% in 2020 of people, they're people we know. They're cousins or aunties or uncles or parents or a lot of people that we know. And then the proportion recruited by intimate partners jumped from 21% to 22% in 2020. So it's particularly noteworthy that sex trafficking in situations, they're people that we know. How does that happen? And I'll give you some of the risk factors. These are the general risk factors for human trafficking across the nation, and I'll give you a specific risk factor diagram for Native Americans. But substance use concern, runaway, so unstable housing, mental health issues, recent migration or relocation, economic hardship, unstable housing, criminal record or criminal history, and again, substance use concern. We know that traffickers find these young people and prey on them, mostly females, but often males as well, and the LGBTQ community, so we're all at risk. And we know here in Spokane we have a large homeless population issue, and we're trying to help folks that live on the street. So if we look at the numbers for the National Crime Information Center, the NCIC is what we call it in the legal world, there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian Alaskan Natives. That was 2018. At that same time, the U.S. Department tracking system called NAMUS only logged 116 cases. So even though we know it's happening at large numbers, they were only tracking a few of those cases. The Center for Disease Control reported that murder is the third leading cause for Native American women. Third leading. Murder. The rates of violence on some reservations can be up to 10 times the national average for any of you that might be in this room. And we're going to talk a lot about the Urban Indian Health Institute, that's the Seattle Indian Health Board report. They really brought to light a lot of these issues. Abigail Echohawk and a number of Indigenous women that just wasn't going to take it anymore. So when we look at, again, some of the data, 4 in 5 Indigenous women have experienced violence in their lifetime. 56% who have experienced sexual violence, 55% who have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner, 48% who have experienced stalking, 66% who have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. We often hear today of gaslighting. Women that are being controlled often with their money and their checkbooks. In the article that we shared with you guys, there was 2 articles, and I hope you read them if you didn't get a chance. One was a real short 4 or 5 page article in the Transportation Research Board, Academy of Sciences. It was a national publication that I break down federal Indian law and some of the risk factors. The second was an article co-authored by myself and Dr. Anderson, really doing a deep dive on murdered missing Indigenous women, and we tell the story of Josephine Rattler. If you guys read that, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's probably towards the last 3 quarters. But Josephine Radler was in a very abusive situation. Her husband was extremely violent. She had kids from him. She had talked to her family about leaving the marriage and finally getting away from this very abusive man. She had been working, I think, at Taco Time, and she planned on the day that she was going to be leaving, it was payday. She was going to pick up her check and just get her kids and get out of there to be safe. Well, it came payday, and when she went to clock out and pick up her paycheck, the manager said, "Oh, well, your husband already picked that up." How does that happen? And it was the next day that she was found. And please read that article. One of our co-authors, Idella Radler, she'll be joining us on the May 5th event. That's part of what we're doing today, is educating folks so people understand what the issues are, and then you guys will be doing an art project for that May 5th event. But there's lots of individual stories, and I'll share some of those stories as we go throughout our presentation today. But just lots of numbers. So I personally work with the Washington State Patrol. In fact, I had contact with the Western Washington tribal liaison, and she said, had some concerns about the funding. So when we went into COVID, they cut the funding for Eastern Washington. They were not. They had vetted a employee that picked an Indigenous woman with an MBA, Spokane Tribal Citizen. She'll be speaking on the May 5th event. But because of COVID, they cut the funding. Well, my partner and I, we were talking to our chairwoman, and so we drafted a letter, sent it to our tribal council. That was a Monday we met with her. Tuesday we sent the letter to tribal council. Our tribal council said, "Hey, we should get the other tribes involved." And this is a statement about what you do matters and how you can make a difference, you as an individual. So they got that letter out to other tribes. Other tribes supported the effort. We happen to be having Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Conference here in the Spokane area. And Affiliated Tribes is 57 tribes in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. All the tribal leaders get together. In fact, we're kind of a powerhouse across the country. Often the National Congress of American Indians president is a member from this region, from AT&I. In fact, right now, our president of the National Congress is Fawn Sharp. She's an Indigenous female from the Quinault Nation, and she's an attorney, just a real badass, has her LLM Masters of Tax Law, I believe. And she's the president. But at AT&I, we put forward, I drafted a resolution, we put, Patsy Whitefoot put it forward on the floor, and all the leaders passed it. It went to our state representatives. We now have Indigenous folks that are state representatives. We have Deborah Leekenoff, we have Chris Stearns, and we have Claudia Kaufman. And so those are people that listen to our issues. Representation matters. And so, for people, as Indigenous people, we're often invisible, but now we have people in the state capitol. And by Monday morning, the Washington State Patrol Director was walking into the Western Washington's office saying, "Who was that person? Let's get her hired." So you can make a difference in your advocacy and the work that you do, because we've seen it happen. And so today we have an Eastern Washington delegate, and she'll be visiting with us on Friday. This is the map. So I had one of my graduate students map out the data, and you can see, there's some hot spots in the middle of our state. So as researchers, I run a couple of research grants in urban planning. I have one called CERTCOM, Small Urban Rural Tribal Center on Mobility. So we look at how people move, we look at transportation, we do studies on tribal transit, different aspects of mobility. We also do research about traffic safety, the high number of fatalities on our highways. And then lastly, I just got another grant For probably 30 years, Eastern Washington University had a grant called TTAP, Northwest Tribal Transportation Technical Assistance. University of Washington got it, but we partnered with them, and so we have part of that grant here at Eastern. We partner with them. So we're looking at and mapping data. When you're educating folks, it's really nice to have visual representations. It tells a story, right? Because most people think, oh, it's King County or something, but you can see that there's a large number in Yakima County. So we first, Jack Rosenblit, one of our graduate students, first mapped this data for us. And then the Washington State Patrol keeps a running list of the indigenous people that are missing, their name, their age, the date they went missing, and the jurisdiction, and who to call. So for many, many years, we have had indigenous people go missing, and there was no place to call. The law enforcement didn't listen to us. It just didn't matter. Now we have a Washington State Patrol who is tracking this. I mean, we've had to take to the streets, but now they're listening. Art matters. You guys can educate and inform people about issues, and people will begin to listen, and that's what we did. It's not keeping this on very well. So one of the things that we do is that we constantly have posters going out. So this is an example of just one poster. Rebecca Johnson went missing, and it gives her description. This goes out over law enforcement. It goes out over emails. People are taking us seriously now. People are listening to us. This wasn't the case before, right? And I'll go through the evolution a little bit, but I just wanted to give you an example of a missing poster. Tribes are doing everything they can. This is a brochure done by the Coeur d'Alene Tribe of Idaho. I was recently asked to go over there and facilitate a discussion for the attorneys and judges session. They had different groups, and because of my legal background, they asked me, hey, Dr. Hill, MargoHill, can you come and facilitate this work group discussion? We had judges and attorneys telling us that other courts were not recognizing our domestic violence orders like restraining orders. So women were being victimized and put at risk because outside courts would not respect tribal court sovereignty, right? Tribal court restraining orders. So in all of our court systems, we have something called comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, which means one jurisdiction is supposed to respect the court decisions of another jurisdiction. And they weren't doing that. State courts were failing to respect the restraining orders, keeping indigenous women safe. So they had a conference and put together who you can call, what kind of information. There's a second flip side of this, and I'll make sure to email it over so you guys have that information. We have a lot of mobility issues with tribal communities. I'm the chair of the board of directors for the American Indian Community Center here in Spokane. And I asked our director and staff, tell me who we have contact with, right? And I'm going to talk about a little bit about the federal Indian policy. But these are all, the green is all the American Indian reservations in this kind of northwest region, right? So these are all the tribes and the homelands of indigenous people. Again, one of our graduate students, Zach Becker, mapped this for me. We went down and we listed all the Indian reservations in this area and identified them under CERTCOM. And then we asked the Indian Center, well, how many tribes are in Spokane? Who comes through here? Who do we provide services? So at the American Indian Center, we provide housing services, Indian child welfare services. We have a food bank. We have employment and training. We just everything you can think of, we do at the American Indian Center. We also serve non-natives. So there's lots of employment services for in fact, just 54% of our population is American Indian Alaska Native. But you can see that there was huge contact between the city and Spokane. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's lots of people, indigenous people, you don't always see them, but why do you think they're in Spokane?
Always been confluence of native traffic. They've always gathered
Right, that's really, historically, inherently, right, it's our land, and this is where Indigenous people gather for salmon fishing and different things. What else today? Why might there be a lot of Indigenous people that come to Spokane?
It's a transportation hub, we've got an international airport, we've got bus systems there through I-90. So I think there'd be some transportation coming to Spokane.
Yeah. So we are the largest urban center between Minneapolis and Seattle. If you look at it, for our reservation, so it is an international hub. Also, what else do we have in Spokane? What are you guys doing right now? Colleges, you bet. We have, Eastern Washington University, we have Whitworth, we have Gonzaga, we have Spokane Falls Community College. So it's a large education center. We also have some urban resources here. We have Native Health. We have the Spokane Tribal TANF, Education, Employment, and Needy Families program. So we have lots of urban systems here. But if you'll think about a little bit about mobility, we go back and forth between our traditional tribal areas and the urban centers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I just wanted you to have a little bit of a picture, the overall. So as I mentioned, I served as our tribe's attorney for over 10 years. And in that capacity, we brought cases, and I'm going to talk about the jurisdictional issues, but many times the U.S. Attorney's Office declined to prosecute. They told my boss, and then when I was a tribal, this isn't a strong enough case. You don't have good evidence. All kinds of a whole litany of reasons why they wouldn't prosecute the cases. There were violent crimes. There were people that hit other people over the head with shovels. There were rapes. Young females in the back of trucks with a gun to their head. There were wives being raped by their husbands, and I'm sorry about the gruesome detail, but just for you to understand, drug outside naked with little rocks getting in the bottom. I mean, brutal crimes that the U.S. Attorney's Office wouldn't prosecute. They tell a little bit different story, but we did everything we could. So when I was tribal attorney, let's say we had some archaic laws. Let's say our molestation law required that we showed enticement. So not only did this individual do the act, but we had to prove that they said, oh, here's some video games, or here's some candy, or something. So we revised our law and order code so it was more succinct and easier to prosecute, or more appropriately prosecuted with less requirements. We also utilized services like from Casey Family Partners, so we had good forensic interviewing, so we could prosecute these guys, right? And nevertheless, I continued to get letters of declination where they declined to prosecute. Why the U.S. Attorney's Office? Because we have a very complicated criminal jurisdiction. When our cops roll up to the scene, they have to make a number of determinations. They have to say, okay, what is the land tenure? Because it matters. It matters who owns the land and the status of the land. In tribal communities on the reservation, we have something called trust property, where the title is held by the United States government for the benefit of the individual Indian or the tribe. So I have land up on the reservation. I bought my great-grandma's house. It's held in trust because I'm a native. So it matters the land title. Next, the officer has to say, okay, what's the crime? If it's a major crime, like murder, rape, arson, then the U.S. Attorney's Office has to prosecute, and the FBI has to come in and do the investigation. Tribal governments do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. Let me say that again. From a case from 1978 called the Oliphant case, we do not have criminal authority, criminal jurisdiction to prosecute non-Indians. So you have non-Indians that come up onto the reservation, and we've opened, the United States government did a process called the Allotment Dawes Act, where they opened up our tribal reservations to non-Indians, and more white settlers came onto our reservation lands, so we have checkerboarded lands. The United States Supreme Court limited our jurisdiction authority over non-Indians, so if I'm up on the reservation and I'm married to a non-Indian, and he beats the hell out of me, the tribal police are limited in what they can do. They can't arrest him and press charges and take him to jail. They have to call the local county sheriff and get somebody to respond to that call. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I can tell you from the chief of police a couple years ago, we had an incident, and this incident was the reverse. It was a female abusing a male. And we called the local county sheriff, they didn't show up. From where we are in Bopanet, it's 1 hour to the county seat to call them. And so, maybe they're short-staffed, and what's our teasing, bless their hearts. Sometimes the sheriff answers, that's a nice way to see, but sometimes they're just racist. And they don't care if some Native woman is getting smacked around. She probably asked for it, is their opinion or attitude. So the other thing is, it's who the perpetrator, what's the race of the perpetrator? Are they Native or non-Native? So we have jurisdiction over Natives of all tribes. If you're Indigenous, then we can arrest you and put you in our jail. But non-Natives, no. And this, it causes lots of problems for drug prosecutions, for domestic violence, for murder, any of those things. So when we're talking about these issues, it matters who is doing the crime. Who's the perpetrator? If it's a non-Indian, I might not be able to protect my niece or my daughter, even though we know what happened, we might have witnesses. So if it's a major crime, like murder, rape, or arson, the FBI is required to come in and do the prosecution, and the U.S. Attorney's Office does the, FBI does the investigation, and the U.S. Attorney's Office has to do the prosecution. And they decline to prosecute in many cases. They're doing a better job today. So it's really important, the research and the work that we do to bring attention to these issues. We work with different organizations across the nation. I've done presentations and articles to try to train transportation officials. I've trained transportation officials across the country. I did a training yesterday for WSDOT, Washington State Department of Transportation, to educate folks that are on the front line. So there are people, maintenance people, let's say at a rest area. We want them trained on why Indigenous women are at risk, because they're the people that if they see something, they say something, right? If they're at a rest area and there's a motorhome where men are getting in and out, or if there's a rest area and there's a tent and some kind of encampment where people are going in and out, then that's suspect. Call somebody. We never want you to confront people, but we want you to make that phone call. There's an app called Truckers Against Trafficking that you can load on your phone. You don't have to confront anybody. You just tell them what you saw, who was there. If you get a license plate or some kind of description, you can report that, and the authorities can follow up with it, right? So the Urban Indian Health did the most amazing report, and I encourage you to take a look at that. Seattle Urban Indian Health did a nice report, and I'm going to talk about some of the data from that. But no, real solid research had been done about rates of violence against Indigenous women. 71%, and this number we think is more like 65. At EW Urban Planning, my graduate students, we look at demographics and data. Live in urban areas. So the Urban Indian Health Institute studied the urban Indigenous population, trying to understand why is this such an epidemic and understanding why Indigenous people are in the city. So the federal government had a number of policies for American Indians. starting in the 40s and the 50s. So once the federal government had all the lands, and then because of treaties and executive orders, they had trust responsibilities. They thought, well, let's assimilate those Indians. Let's just put them into the melting pot. We don't want any responsibilities. It's better for them if they assimilate and become your average mainstream American and not live on Indian reservations anymore. So they had policies called relocation. My grandparents were in Seattle, of course, working during World War II. My mother was born in Seattle in 1942. My partner, his mom was relocated to Los Angeles. And I had one of my graduate students map it. But first they wanted to assimilate us, then they wanted to terminate tribal governments, right? They didn't want to recognize our special, unique status. So termination is an actual federal Indian policy from the 1950s. And one of the amazing people that we honor here at Eastern Washington University is Lucy Covington. Lucy Covington was a warrior. She was a Native woman from the Cabo tribe, and she was amazing. And she almost single-handedly fought termination for the Cabo tribe of Indians. It was the U.S. government's policy to terminate tribal governments, and she said no. And they were dangling money, dollars, saying, hey, if you guys agree to terminate, of course they'd take all of our land, but then you'd get a check for $10,000 or something. And that was a lot. For tribal people back in the 40s and 50s, that was a huge amount of money. So we were located here, but we were relocated 48 miles northwest to the Spokane Indian Reservation. Because of geography, we have high unemployment rates and not a lot of opportunity, right? So it was really hard back in the 50s and 60s, and when the United States government was trying to terminate tribes, they were real vulnerable. People were living in poverty, and they thought, hey, I could do a lot with my 10,000, my kids, we could relocate, but all these promises. And Lucy Covington fought termination. A number of the tribal council at her tribe were pro-termination. They're like, yeah, let's get this money. And she sold her own personal cows to make sure that she could fly back to Washington, D.C. and testify. And so she almost single-handedly saved the Cabo tribe. She got other people on board. She educated folks, said, hey, we will no longer be Native American. We will just be citizens like everybody else and not have our special, unique structures and culture. So the federal government had a relocation program where they sent American Indians out into cities. For example, you can see Alaska Natives were sent to Seattle. Folks from Washington State, like the Cabo tribe, were sent into California. Folks from New Mexico sent up to Chicago. And there's lots of stories. One of my tribal leader friends, Melton Askett, when he was working, one of the BIA agents, Bureau of Indian Affairs, said that there was an Alaska Native who was relocated to Seattle. Now, Alaska Natives are amazing. They have skills. They can, they maybe hunt seal and whale. They know how to preserve them, how to live out in the bush and in the tundra, build homes. They're just amazing. And here was an Alaska Native that was relocated into Seattle. And the BIA agent said, oh, if you have any problems, just call me. And the Alaska Native called back and said, I don't know where I'm at. And the BIA agent said, well, what does the sign say? And he said, the sign says walk and don't walk. So that sounds crazy to us, right? But here's somebody who's grown up in Alaska, had amazing skills, could hunt and fish and provide for their families, but they're relocated to urban area that's completely foreign. Some of the Caldwells were relocated to California. One of my grandma friends, Loretta Pacotas, talked about her and her husband and children being relocated to near the Los Angeles area. I think it might have been Sacramento. But she said that from the time there was a Navajo couple, a Dene couple living next door, and from the time the husband went to work, he could hear the wife cry because all she spoke was the Dene language. So she didn't have an ability to communicate, and so you send people out into these urban areas, and people still aren't giving them jobs, the housing wasn't great, all the promises doesn't happen. It's really a disruption of our family systems. It's hard on our communities and culture, but that was a official United States policy was relocated. So this happened between the 1950s and 1970s. I study mobility. Oh yes, yeah.
Is it a deliberate effort to send them far away so that they would not be able to return?
Yes. In fact, that was often the policy for boarding schools, so that they could have no cultural connection. And you can see, like from New Mexico, that's a great point, Florian, that people were moved to Chicago. It was a different climate. There were no connections to their family. Just throw them into a city. Barely housing, low minimum wage jobs, again, assimilation, melting pot. We don't want any more Native Americans. It was to wipe it. It was relocation, and then they were moving to terminate our tribes at home. Great question. So my research here at the university is looking at transportation and mobility, how Indigenous people move. So it is our tribal custom to go from our cities back to our reservation communities, back to our tribal communities. That is our cultural obligation and DNA. So these are my daughters. That's my daughter, Patricia. She's currently at Oregon Health Sciences University. She's applying for medical school, and that's her with her, one of our grandmas. She beaded the dress, Inez. And so it's one of our tribal powwows that she's talking and telling a story with the grandmas. And then this is my daughter with my dad going home for ceremony, for holiday. We are fully expected to be connected to our tribal communities, go to the Longhouse to help out. So our Indigenous mobility patterns is from our reservation communities to the city, right? And then back and forth. And frankly, our traveling, our practice routes of travel to see our parents and grandparents, all of these systems have been happening for hundreds, thousands of years, but our current systems of travel just are not keeping up with us. So I can tell you, and I'm going to show you a video here in just a little minute, we move, and often there's women that are hitchhiking in our tribal communities that are, the United States government intentionally pushed us onto reservations that are much like concentration camps. We hear about the American Holocaust, we hear about the Jewish Holocaust, but we never hear about the American Holocaust. So the city of Spokane was our homeland, but we were forced and relocated to a very rural area that nobody else wanted. They told us, go be farmers, and then what? All the white farmers took all the best lands. In Reardon and Davenport, we don't own any land up there. They pushed us up on the Indian reservation on Rocky Mountains, right? Why don't we go ahead and show a short video. So my partner and I, Jeff Ferguson, we wrote and produced a video up on our reservation. We partnered with County Coon Media, and then you'll see my cousin singing the song, and my other cousin, who's kind of a drinker, he's at the fireplace, and his girlfriend, Lisa Weaselhead. So this is the big premiere of Stephen Ford, who's my cousin, Isaac Tenasket, who's going to be singing the song. He's one of my cousins. And we wrote and produced this video and then partnered with County Coon Media.
Sisters, can you say they're in danger? 1, 2, 3, they're in pain. Feels like one of my sisters go missing every day.
Well, are you sure he's here?
Yeah, I'm sure.
All right, well, are you gonna be okay?
Yes, I'm fine. Don't worry about me.
Okay, well, let me know.
I will. Uncle, have you seen Johnny?
Help me find all of my sisters. Can you say they're in danger? 1, 2, 3. They're in pain. Feels like one
I
of
thought you were
my
gonna get a
sisters
job.
go missing
Yeah, I
every
said I'd do that on Monday.
It is Monday. You don't even know what day it is?
Relax, have a beer, huh? Beer!
I don't want that.
It was a good beer, huh? What's your deal, huh?
Think about our kids.
What about them?
But this is not the life that you promised me. And this is not the life our ancestors envisioned for us.
Well, if you want to stay, stay. If you want to go, go.
I will.
Go.
I'm gonna go then. Fine, I'm out of here.
Go on.
danger. 1, 2, 3. They're in pain.
Hey, we ain't going nowhere. Go on, choose. Right, boys?
Hey, you're Johnny's girlfriend, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Do I know you?
Yeah, Mike, his friend from out of town.
I don't know no Mike.
He never talked to you about me?
Not that I can think of.
Hey, it's pretty dark and cold out. Do you want to ride?
I don't know. I'm almost there.
Oh, there's lots of creepy guys out here. Come on, let me give you a ride.
I guess if you say you know Johnny.
See? Isn't that better?
There's a growing human and sex trafficking industry that actively targets Native American reservations and indigenous populations. Traffickers and sexual predators believe they are less likely to be caught or prosecuted when the crime takes place in Indian country. According to the Urban Indian Health Institute, murder is the third leading cause of death among indigenous women. And when analyzing death certificates, the National Institute of Justice reports the rate of violence against indigenous women are sometimes 10 times that of other American women. More than 4 out of 5 American Indian, Alaskan Native women have experienced some kind of violence inflicted against them in their lifetime. While sex traffickers and predators are a major part of this phenomenon, indigenous women are frequently subjected to violence, psychological as well as physical, from their own intimate partners. The National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center has alarmingly reported that American Indians and Alaskan Natives are 2.5 times more likely to experience violent crimes and 2 times more likely to experience rape or sexual assault crimes compared to all other races. These statistics reveal a striking and disproportionate predatory threat facing indigenous women and girls. While solutions for MMIW are complex and challenging, predators must be prosecuted. There are actions that law enforcement, the U.S. Attorney's Office, transportation agencies, and tribal leaders can adopt to fight trafficking and aid victims. For more information, contact the Washington State Patrol Tribal Liaison in your area.
Sisters, can you say they're in danger? 1, 2, 3, they're in pain. Feels like one of my sisters gone missing.
So a seemingly innocent, dispute with your partner, and you think you're gonna go for a short walk. On maybe walkways you've walked your entire life. As I said, I grew up on the reservation, and I walked that route from the tribal, that house was my great-grandmother's. And I was the auntie telling her, okay, giving her the talk before she got out of my car, because we have to do that. I often do these trainings at colleges, from Gonzaga to Spokane Falls Community College, and I'm coaching young women, and men for that matter, about being careful where they park their car, being careful that their phones are charged. I can give you, in the presentation, I had a number of scenarios that happened right here in Spokane, that happened in bars downtown, where people were drugged, or people were attacked when they went out to charge their phone, or even going to a grocery store to cash her paycheck. You are at risk. And so as an Indigenous female, there are a lot of risk factors, because these predators are out on the reservation. They know they won't be prosecuted. If you're in the Yakima Nation, that's 1.2 million acres. And there was a dispute between the Washington State Patrol and the Yakima Nation about retrocession, tribes taking back that jurisdiction, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But Indigenous women are moving from the urban cities where they're trying to go to college and get a job and provide for their families, back to their tribal communities. That's the mobility, how we move back and forth. There's a powerful book, if you get a chance, Highway of Tears by one of my friends, Jessica McDermott. It's about First Nations in Canada. There was a particular highway, and it is on Audible, and so you can listen to it, but it's really powerful about a particular highway that women would walk or hitchhike, and Highways of Tears, there were multiple predators. There were young white males. There was I think maybe he was 21. There was a judge that was preying on young Indigenous girls who would go downtown and pick them up, and folks that were in the sex trade, if you will, knew that this judge was a predator, as well as there was a serial killer. And so the book Highway of Tears tells all that in great detail, and I highly recommend it. It talks about transportation and mobility. So I am a mother, and I don't have a lot of money, so when my kids are traveling to University of Washington, they would often catch the bus. So I was down at the Greyhound one day, bringing my son to catch the bus to go back to Seattle, and there was a young Indigenous woman, and she looked distraught and upset. And so I said, "Is everything okay?" And she said, "Can I use your phone?" And she goes, "My phone died." And so she was trying to get a bus ticket. Her mom was back in the Dakotas, trying to buy North Dakota, buying her ticket. Her name was Ivory, and the bus was pulling out. So as Indigenous people, we don't always have state ID. We do have our tribal ID. And because of land tenure in our reservation communities, banks don't rush out to set up on the Spokane Indian Reservation. So we don't have banks in our communities, so we don't have credit cards. A lot of people still deal in cash systems. So when the individuals that live in my grandma's house come to pay me the rent that I share with all my family, they show up and they give me cash. So we have cash systems. Because people don't understand trust, property, and land tenure. So Ivory was stuck downtown. She had been up on the Kalispel Indian Reservation. She got in an altercation with her boyfriend. His family took her and dropped her off at the bus station. She called her mom. Her mom was trying to buy her a bus ticket, but they wouldn't let, there was some, she wasn't tech savvy, and they wouldn't let Ivory do it in person because she didn't have a credit card on her, and she had tribal. So there's all these reasons that make it hard just to get a bus ticket. And then the bus pulled out and left. She was there crying. And I didn't know her from anybody. I said, I'm Margo, I'm a Spokane. If you need a place to stay, you're welcome to come and stay with me. and we'll get you a bus ticket tomorrow. So she came home and stayed with me, and my kids think I'm crazy because I often have people that live with us, my cousin, my nephew, and so she came and slept on her couch, and the next day her mom was able to buy her a bus ticket. And we got her back to her brothers and then back to her mom. But those are seemingly innocent situations that lead to tragic results. Indigenous women are often thought of as exotic, that were very much sought after in the trafficking realm. So again, looking at the numbers, half of Indigenous women have experienced domestic violence. Many DV perpetrators are non-native, and we have no jurisdiction over them. 67% of child abuse cases are thrown out by the U.S. Attorney's Office. We had one molestation case that we had forensic interviews, and I'm sorry for the detail, but the molester was yanking on this little boy's private, and they didn't prosecute the case. They said that the perpetrator was not an ideal person to prosecute. He was older, was on an oxygen tank. We had done everything. As I mentioned, we had modified our law and order code. We had forensic interview, and still the U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't prosecuting somebody who molested multiple generations of victims. And that's what happens sometimes in Indian country. Many of you guys have heard about the church and the diocese and the different victims of molestation by Catholic priests. They go unprosecuted for many years. That's why there's so much heartbreak and historical trauma in Indian country, because you have these molestations going on at government schools, at church, mission schools, and there's not much support for the victim, right? So we have a lot of these issues going on. And you just see the domestic violence, pregnant, homeless, there's all these issues happening, and 85% of the perpetrators identified as male, and half of those were non-native. So if we look at the geography, as an urban planner, I look at geography, I look at demographics. The major cities where some of this was happening, New Mexico, cities like Albuquerque, 37. Washington, cities like Seattle, 45. Guess what? My daughter's going to University of Washington when I put this slide together. It scares the hell out of me. And my son, right? My daughter, thank goodness, she's has a black belt in Taekwondo. So I worry a little bit less. But my younger daughter is also going to Bellevue. When you have these major urban areas, women are sometimes victimized, right? And there's the data, a leading city for murdered missing Indigenous women. Arizona, you have cities like Tucson, Alaska, Anchorage, Montana, Billings, and so forth. Indigenous women, we are, as identified by Urban Indian Health, law enforcement doesn't pay attention to us. We go missing. The media doesn't report, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But we go missing in the data. They weren't reporting us in some of those reports. So I'm going to move through this. You guys got this story about Idella. She's, grew up on the Northern Arapaho Reservation. She lived in Los Angeles and in Seattle. As a young girl, she was at the Yakama Nation powwow, and her grandmother got a bad feeling, a gut feeling. And so they packed up their camp and went home to Seattle. Her grandparents were well known in the Seattle area and was kind of like a safe haven. When they got there, the house was all locked up, and her aunt was found deceased in the home. No explanation, no anything, and she had been murdered, but they didn't know there was no investigation that had happened. Idella went to study at the University of Missoula, Montana. Her sister was living on the Wind River. They grew up on the Wind River Reservation, and then she got the phone call that something had happened to her sister. She loaded up and drove all the way there. Idella, and in my article, which many of you are going to read or did read, she had been watching Law and Order, and so when she pulled up, she expected to see yellow tape And police officers do an investigation, nothing. There was no yellow tape, there was nobody investigating the crime. Her sister had been brought to the hospital and laid outside the emergency doors. It just so happened that a nurse looked out and seen the body out there, said, oh my God, and it was freezing temperatures. And so they went out and collected the body, but she had already passed. No investigation, no charges brought against her husband. That's the husband that picked up the paycheck before she could get off work and get away from her abuser. This happens every day in cities across our country, in cities across our state. So Adela also was in an abusive relationship in Montana, and the officer said, you know, she had gone home, her ex-boyfriend broke in and beat her up and committed crimes, and his new girlfriend was out in the car. The police finally got there. Again, there was very little that the police were willing to do or could do under the current state of the laws. And they said, we recommend you move someplace that's going to protect you. So she moved here to Washington. The laws will protect you a little bit better here in domestic violence situations. So please read that story. But if you look at some of the risk factors, this is a diagram that I had one of my graduate students help me create. The structural discrimination, legal processes and jurisdictional issues that we've been talking about, the public policies and institutional practices, you know, no banks or finance institutions on Indian reservations, cultural representations, law enforcement norms, oh, they're just drunk Indians, oh, they're a prostitute, she's a drug addict. All those people that are living on the street, people dismiss. Oh, those homeless people, they're that way because they want to be, gay people, they're asking for it, they're substance abuse, nothing to how our society treats individuals and the hurt and pain that they might be using the alcohol with, right? So again, no banks, so we have cash systems, lack of resources. The individual factors, maybe there's poverty, no stable housing, no reliable transportation, education, already been exposed to violence and sexual assault, addiction, sexual and physical and emotional abuse, mobility, safety. In our tribal communities, disparities in opportunity, maybe education systems aren't great, lack of employment, poverty, violence, addiction, loss of land, culture, language, and identity. Those are all factors that lead to issues of historical trauma and pain and make us greater risk factors for murdered, missing Indigenous women. Why does it happen? Why do we go missing? I can tell you, because these factors. So just as a reminder, critical issues of tribal jurisdiction, we have no jurisdiction over non-Indians, a shortage of tribal law enforcement. We spend $13,000, $15,000 to send our tribal members down to the Fletsy Police Academy down in Arcadia, New Mexico, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Academy. They get those, excellent federal training. They come home and work for us. Our tribes don't have the money. There are some tribes, Kalispel tribe, where they have casinos and different things. The Spokane tribe doesn't have the money. And then our law enforcement officers get hired away to other jurisdictions. So in Indian country, Yakama Nation, they have a shortage of law enforcement. You guys are going to be looking at the maps and why are so many Indigenous people going missing Yakama? Shortage of law enforcement. You have a large rural land base, 1.2 million acres, and we don't have the law enforcement. Poor relationships with local counties. As I mentioned, sometimes the sheriff doesn't show up when we call them. Complex jurisdictional issues. On the Yakama Reservation, there's a law called PO 280, where the state did have jurisdiction. The Yakama Nation simply exercised their tribal sovereignty, retroceded jurisdiction, and Washington State Patrol said, okay, then you patrol your land, right? But that's not the law. If you look at the United States Supreme Court's case A1 contractors, when you have those state highways going through the reservation, Washington State Patrol has jurisdiction. So it's their legal obligation. They said things like, oh, our insurance won't cover it. That's not the law. That's not true. So, complexities of law create, law enforcement that aren't going to go and do the job. They're doing better now. As I said, we worked with the Washington State Patrol. They now have 2 tribal liaisons. They're doing the work. They're patrolling the reservation, but this was the case and why we have such large numbers. Sometimes there's prejudice and institutional racism. We work really well with some counties. Spokane County will come out and do SWAT exercises on the reservation. Other counties, they won't show up when we call them. So it's a huge issue. Major crimes, like I said, the FBI has to investigate. U.S. Attorney's Office often declines. And then Washington State Patrol, not long ago, there was a accident on the highway going through the reservation, and they refused to do the investigation because there were some Native Americans, Yakima tribal members, that were part of the fatality, the wreck. It's their job, right? And to say that our insurance won't cover it, those are just excuses. So lots of issues going on. Human sex trafficking, I want to give you a couple of examples. So this case was in North Dakota, Dusty Morissette. He was 23, he was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. Bismarck, the U.S. Attorney's Office, said Morissette is a predator that targeted and exploited young girls and women at the Fort Berthold Reservation. He sexually abused multiple young girls, engaged minor children to sell drugs for him. He used physical force, coercion, to force these young women to perform sex acts for money. There was a climate of fear that he created for these young girls and women on the reservation, and that was to be no more. Another case, Alaska, there was a charter boat captain, Randall Scott. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. For over a long period of time, he had sex with teenage girls and supplied girls with meth and drugs. 4 of the 6 teenage girls were under the age of 16. So we're talking 14, 15, come on. What kind of refusal skills do you have at that point in time? So the media, I'm not going to cover all of this, and if you guys have any questions, please raise your hand. But 95% of the cases weren't covered by media. A vast majority, they just said, oh, that reservation is just full of violence. This minimizes the issues of that we have here in the cities. It bolsters the stereotypes that American Indians living on reservations are just violence-ridden environments. The media use language perceived as violent or victim blaming. They're prostitutes, they're drug addicts, they're homosexuals, or whatever the videos were, the media was covering. Drugs, alcohol, sex work, gang violence. They would talk about the victim's criminal history and make excuses for the perpetrator. If we think about the media and how they've dealt with some of these issues, and when women go missing, what is a name that we can all name when we think about women going missing?
Gabby Petito.
Gabby Petito. Every single one of us know that name. But when Indigenous women go missing, nobody covers it. Nobody cares, they don't write about it, they don't report it on the news. So we're doing everything we can to make sure law enforcement are doing their job. And that, again, that includes getting our tribal liaison with Washington State Patrol. So it's difficult to detect human trafficking cases. Victims, are promised a better life. Hey, you're so beautiful. I'd love to have you in my video. There's all kinds of talk that these traffickers know how to talk to you. You are so good looking. We'd love to have you in our movie video or our music video. Why don't you come down and we'd love to. All of those things that a young person would love to hear, right? We're doing a test pilot for this streaming services, whatever it is. And often victims have a history of victimization. There was a case where in Alaska where a priest had been molesting a young girl. The law enforcement blamed her dad and arrested the dad when she got pregnant. DNA showed that it was actually the priest of the local Catholic Church that actually fathered the child. But the making those allegations, which law enforcement so quickly believed, ruined not just her life, but the father's life, right? So we have lots of victimization. How can we help? What can we do? Often perpetrators are caught because we do the training. In the Alaska charter boat captain case, there were health workers. They had a task force that trained healthcare workers to identify issues that might help them solve crimes. One of the healthcare workers identified that all these young girls had the same sexually transmitted disease because they were being forced to have sex with the same man, and the 14, 15-year-old girls. And so this task force helped arrest that charter boat captain and bring him to justice. So I won't talk about this, but there's an amazing law review article out of the Willamette School of Law about Native Americans in foster care systems that age out. That's happened right here in the city. My brother and some of my friends work for Spokane Tribal Tana. One of our clients went missing, and she was somebody who had alcohol issues. She had been adopted out, and so she didn't have her family here in the city of Spokane, and she ended up being found dead, and there were lots of questions. She wasn't a drug user, but she was found with drugs in her system. She drank and ran around back in the day, and she was beaten and left half naked, and our caseworkers went down to the hospital. And so the truth of her crime never really came out, and so there's lots of these stories that we could tell. So we're doing all that we can. Navajo Nation has passed legislation. We have the Violence Against Women Act that was finally reauthorized. It originally failed by one senator, Bob Goodlatte, who did not want it to pass because of the requirements that would put on law enforcement. So we have something called the Tribal Law and Order Act that expands jurisdiction with some pilot projects to help tribal communities bring these cases and prosecute some of these cases. Savannah's Act. Savannah was a young Indigenous female who was lured into the upstairs neighbor apartment. They cut her baby from her womb and took her out and dumped her body, Savannah Greywind. And it's just gruesome. And the cops went to every home in the apartment complex, and they seen the baby. There was obviously a baby in a crib, and they questioned the white couple and to not much avail. Later they found out it was actually that couple in her unit that cut the baby from her. So it's Savannah's Act is a law. You could look up and look at the newspaper clippings if you were going to do an art demonstration and understand. But we have a bill now requiring law enforcement to track and report data. And again, it was blocked by one politician from Virginia. But we have challenges of accessing data, policymakers making informed decisions to address the violence. There was a young girl who was in Montana, and she had basically gotten in a fight with her mom that we all might do, right? And to de-steam, she went to the local park. She was sitting on a park bench, and men came up behind her and put a bag over her head, took her into the van, and they took her down to Mexico and trafficked her. They were in a little wooden shed out back, and her and another girl said, we're going to get out of here, we're going to survive this. They dug a hole out of that little wooden shed, and they said, just run like hell, don't look back, don't look back. They ran and ran. She ran one direction, the other girl went another direction. She made it to the border, the Mexico-American border in California, and she was able to call her family in Montana, and they came and got her. She never did know what happened to the other girl. She made it out safe, but we never know what happened. And that's just, again, one story that I know from the American Indian Community Center, one of our clients. Lots of stuff going on here. My niece Desiree went to a Walmart parking lot on Pines and Sullivan. She was just going to cash her paycheck. Some guy blocked her in, and she called her mom, and her mom said, don't you get out of that car. You call the police didn't come. And she was honking a horn, and her mom said, I'm on my way. Finally, that guy that was blocking her left, because clearly she wasn't getting out of the car. They were starting to attract attention. You do everything you can to protect yourself. I had a Nikki, my niece Nikki, she was downtown, she felt something weird happening, somebody had Mickeyed her drink. She got to the bathroom, the girls in the bathroom got her an Uber and got her home. We had to do everything we can to protect ourselves. Another case, there was a Yakima tribal female, she was at a downtown bar, her phone went dead. I always tell my girls, don't let your phone go dead, not that we need to be on it, but it's protection in some cases. So she went out to get her charger, got attacked, she woke up under the bridge, under a 12-foot fence in a tiny hole, her shirt was ripped, she was beat up, she had to crawl out, her money, wallet, everything was gone. And then the one last story that I told you was Marlene from Northern Cheyenne. Here in Spokane, foster care for many years, she aged out. She was found with no shoes, no phone, and there were drug allegations, and not much of an investigation, and not any media coverage. So lots of vulnerabilities for human trafficking, runaway, and homeless youth. Minors cannot consent to sexual activity. You can't call them prostitutes or sex workers. They legally cannot consent to sexual activity. Those involved in trafficking control all the basic necessities of this victim. They bring them in. They say, "Oh, I love you. You can stay at my home. I'm your boyfriend. I love you. You're going to do this for me. I've been paying for you. I've been providing for you. If you love me, you'll do just whatever talk. We need to have this happen. If you don't do it, I'm going to go get your little sister." There's multiple, I can tell you, I do a lot of work with the Healing Lodge of 7 Nations, which is a youth treatment facility here in Spokane. I spent 5 hours reviewing their mental health code yesterday, or their magazine and their research project. There was a young girl that was in treatment, getting clean and sober, and her PIP back at her reservation said, "If you don't leave that place and come back and get back to work for me, I'm going to get your little sister." So traffickers threaten your family, and they threaten the people you love, or exposure. I have this video, I'm going to expose all embarrassment, shame, all those kind of things. So just being aware. This one, John's customers in Oregon, I told you about the law review article for Willamette College of Law. They found that in Oregon, they were giving them Saturday school for the Johns. If we get a traffic ticket, if we don't want it to go on our record, we can go to traffic school. They were doing that in Oregon for these perpetrators, for these Johns. If they got busted, here, we'll let you go to Saturday school, and then it won't go on your record. So they're prosecuting the victims, the women that are being used for sex, and then they let the Johns off the hook. That's how it was working. And we do that all the time. So lots of prosecution challenges. When you're in trauma, you're embarrassed, you don't want to talk to a prosecutor, your life's been threatened. I've read stacks and stacks of reports. Women are beaten, they're promised love and loyalty. You have mixed emotions because now you feel like you love your perpetrator. You feel you're confused. You're a young female. This man has provided and loved you, and now he's turning you out. And so you don't want to testify. It's just real mixed emotions. And thinking about being a young person, young female or young male, this is the only love you know. If you're in a foster home or you're being abused, they have great power over you. And so trial, go to court, and a trial is hard on victims. It's devastating. They're struggling physically, mentally, and emotionally. Women get trafficked at church conventions. When you have the Super Bowl, all of these are big places that women are trafficked and young men. In another one in tribal communities, when you have these oil fields, right, and they're extracting natural resources, they have large numbers of man camps where, the oil companies say, "Don't worry, those tribal police have no jurisdiction over you." They are told ahead of time that the tribal law enforcement can't do anything to them. You have these man camps, and there was a young boy, I think he was like 12 years old, that was passed around from trailer to trailer, and sexually violated again and again, drugged, and then passed around. So really dangerous places. Foster care. Now today, attorneys are responding. I can tell you that I had a family member that was assaulted, and the U.S. attorneys called our family in and said, what do you want to see happen? A little tiny gal that had had her skull fractured, the U.S. Attorney's Office are now prosecuting these cases. There was a drug dealer out at the Northern Quest Casino. The law enforcement came in, they had the case, they prosecuted the person, got 10 years, I think. So now they're taking it serious. We're protecting victims, juvenile victims. The Choctaw Nation said victims shall be housed and sheltered. We will not detain them and put them in jail. We will get them the services they need, legal services, we're going to get them medical care, we're going to provide protection. So there's a full change of attitude of how we're dealing with these individuals and victims. So what are the solutions? And I'm done. We need collaborative efforts across jurisdictions, tribal, state, and county. We need standardized protocol for responding to these cases. We need resources for law enforcement. We need U.S. attorneys to continue to prosecute these cases. In Washington State Patrol is an example. We've got 2 tribal liaisons, one here in Eastern Washington and one in Western Washington. It helps law enforcement identify the people that are missing and the people who maybe it's a runaway. When we look at those numbers, maybe it's someone that's run away 2 or 3 or 4 times. Maybe it's somebody that is living with somebody else because they're in a bad situation. But then there are people that are really missing, right? And so we want to help law enforcement identify those individuals. For young people, if you have nieces or nephews, educate their parents about social media. I can tell you that one of my cousins, her son was being contacted through a firewall, through a video gaming system. Her son was in there playing video games, seems innocent. They had broken through the firewall and contacted her son, got the son to crawl out the window. They were mixing like cough syrup. There's all kinds of things on YouTube about mixing cough syrup and soda. And he was at the local casino out of it, totally vulnerable. But that's what happens when people can access your children through firewalls. We think they're safe. We think they're just in their bedroom. But people have access to them. So parents need to be educated. So we often wear our ribbon skirts, and we do everything we can to bring the attention. Many of you have seen the handprint over the face, trying to silence Indigenous women. No more. I did an interview a while back for the Inlander. And they quoted me. It's a little embarrassing because my kids are like, God, Mom, cussing, at the reporter. But I'm like, shit, we got to take to the streets to get recognition and get people to listen to us. So that's partly where art is so important, is because you can call attention to important issues. Last year, my partner and I he was asked to do a project, organize an art project with MMIW with Gonzaga at the Guac. And we brought in artists, and they had interpretive expressions of Indigenous women and our strength and victimization. And it wasn't sad. There were grandmas and aunties that came and told their stories. I did this presentation. We're going to share some of those videos on the 5th. Abigail Eckelhoff tells an amazing story, but we represent, this is my daughter at the canoe journey. This is one of our Cowlitz tribal members. She raced out here at Eastern. We hosted the statewide track champion tournaments. And she said, I'm trying to bring recognition to murdered missing Indigenous women. And she put up a poster board. And my partner does a story on this, and they said, well, what's that for? She said, it's for every medal that I'm going to win today. She was inspired by a older Indigenous woman who was running like the Boston Marathon or the New York, and with the handprint. And she said, do you mind if I do that as well? She won every one of her categories, and put every one of her medals. And one of our young men from Wopanet, Gabriel Kiefer, gave her his medal to hang on her poster board to bring attention. Angeli Fish, I think. She's a Cowlitz Tribe member, but I'm sure we'll know more about it. So what can we do? For families, we say contact law enforcement. If law enforcement doesn't respond, find another agency that will take the report. We have tribal liaisons that will listen. Enlist trusted family members to support with police and media. Get spiritual and cultural support and advice. Record, write it down in a notebook, social media, communication with officials. Use brief, basic language with the family so we can get to the bottom of what's going on. Gather and track any additional information. Preserve all evidence. Enlist trusted, supportive community help. If missing several years, communicate with the coroner and BIA probate. Yesterday at the governor's office, we see Governor Inslee and Attorney General Bob Ferguson signed the cold case unit. We are going to solve these crimes here in Washington State. So what are we doing as preventative measures? We are educating our young Indigenous girls, and these are my last slides. These are the little swans out of the Yakama Nation. The tribal elders are educating these young girls in their language and culture and songs, and they are making them strong women. We all need to support each other as women, as people that are at the fringes. We need to support each other and make each other strong. So these are the little swans. We are doing what we can as Indigenous women. We have scientists, we have leaders. These are my heroes. Debbie Abrahamson fought on the right, fought mining companies that were polluting uranium on our reservation. And the other one is Shelley Boyd. She's a scientist from the Sinipe, the Caldwell Band, fighting for recognition in Canada of her tribe. So Indigenous women are taking our place of strength. This is Sharice Davids from the Ho-Chunk Nation in Kansas. She's a total badass. She's a mixed martial arts MMA fighter as well as an attorney. She's in the United States Congress. And then, of course, Deborah Holland. She's a Laguna Pueblo, a U.S. Congress, now the Secretary of Interior. She's now protecting all of our lands, right? So we have female congresswomen. We have judges. Diane Humptiwa is Hopi. We have other judges that here in the state of Washington Supreme Court. It's amazing and powerful. So there's lots of historical situations that you now understand, that colonialism. I talked about historical leaders, Huistoc's Way. We changed the name up at Spokane Falls from George Wright Drive to Huistoc's, empowering Indigenous women. We can be activists with our education and our degrees and our art. That was just Lucy Covington, the female that we honor here at Eastern Washington University, who fought termination of her tribe. We have medicine women and women that are working to heal our families with roots and medicines. And so there's lots of things that we can do and federal policies that have worked against us. We are working towards living good lives and having purpose and balance with our cultural teachings. And we have scientists and attorneys. Autumn Dawn, she was an attorney that fought the pharmaceutical companies in the opioid crisis. We have scientists that are working to protect the environment. Our communities come together to keep us close. And that's all I have.